We return to seeking the truth about Atlantis, legend, myth, or lost continent. You decide, as we examine the Atlantis puzzle here on Things Visible and Invisible. Jack Kelley is an American writer, director, and producer, known for his documentary work and storytelling. After studying ancient history, philosophy, literature, and architecture at Yale University, he moved into media and filmmaking, founding Empire Builder Productions, an independent media company focused on documentaries, and subsequently became the director, writer, and producer of the Atlantis Puzzle. And he joins me down the line from his home in New Mexico. Jack, welcome to Things Visible and Invisible.
Thanks for having me, Seán. Glad to be here.
Now, you must have had this said to you many times, Jack, but Atlantis is such a well-worn subject. Is there anything new to be said about it?
If you'd asked me a few years ago, I would have said you'd be nuts to believe so, but in fact, it's the case.
Okay, and you've made a film about it. Before we start our conversation, Jack, let's just have a look at your trailer, first of all. So we're going to play the trailer and then we'll come straight back in.
Atlantis, a lost continent that allegedly sank beneath the waves. Ancient Greek manuscripts written by Plato are the myth's source. But what if the story we think we know is wrong? For the first time, fresh research and new translations are revealing long misunderstood facts that transform Atlantis from fantasy into an incredible reality. Join me on a journey across continents and centuries as together we uncover the truth behind the Atlantis puzzle.
Okay, Jack, so you have set out a little bit in the trailer of your sort of thesis, but I think we need to dig a little bit more into it. First of all, tell me, how did you get into the subject of Atlantis? I mean, you're a very well-educated man with many possibilities of intellectual inquiry. Why Atlantis?
Total happenstance, Seán. Like many wonderful things in life, came to me by accident. I was on the island of Santorini in Greece in 2019 with my wife on vacation. We were visiting an ancient ruin site there called Akrotiri. It's from about 1600 BC when the island volcano exploded and buried this advanced Minoan civilization under about, 10 meters worth of ash. So today you can go and see it. It's incredible. Well, while I was there in the hotel lobby, waiting for a taxi, my wife just grabs this book off the bookshelf there and says, hey, you might want to take a look at this. And it's a book about a conference, an academic conference that took place in the Greek islands in 2008 about Atlantis. So I was surprised. Hadn't brought anything good to read with me by the pool. So, I'm flipping through pages. A lot of it was kind of the typical fare you might expect. But I came across the work of this Greek researcher named George Sarantitus. And that's where my whole mindset about everything I'd ever heard, everything I'd ever thought about Atlantis began to change.
And what was it about his work that particularly struck you?
It was well done, Seán. He had done the research. He spoke ancient Greek. He understood philosophy. He understood history. He was a multifaceted thinker who had gone back and uncovered some really surprising mistranslations in the original ancient Greek story of Atlantis that shifted the way you should think about it, the paradigm from, hey, this is just an allegory, it's just fantasy, to, hey, wait a minute, suddenly this is looking a lot like this is set in a real place. And of course, that doesn't necessarily mean every word of it's true. What it means is this is something worth investigating.
Before we get into what his thesis was, what you have realized on screen, Jack, let's set out this sort of generalized view of Atlantis, certainly the view that you would have known prior to that. So you've alluded to the fact that the Atlantis appears in the writings of Plato, but as you say, people thought of it as an allegory. Was there much more to it than that? I mean, that people thought that this was a mythic idea that was floating around ancient Greece?
That's as far as we know in the written record where it began, Sean. But I think most people today have this idea of Atlantis as it's sort of the king of the conspiracy theories, right? It's the Godzilla or the King Kong of that world, and it's become a sort of a catch-all for any idea of a prehistoric advanced civilization, for anything from transdimensional stuff to UFOs to ancient power plants and all this kind of stuff. But I think it's also gotten into media, right? Hollywood filmmaking, 20th century books and so forth. My sister-in-law is recently in a musical about Atlantis in Europe. So, it's all over, and it's in the popular imagination. And today we got stuff like Aquaman, running around talking to fish and living in an undersea place. So whatever the original context or connotation of the story, we've lost it. And I think that's the place that we have to approach, is just like with an archaeological dig, we got to go back to the original story to refresh ourselves on what the heck is this really about?
Okay, so it's one thing to be gripped by a book by the pool on a holiday, that I understand, but you took it to an extreme, if I may say, Jack, because this became something that you worked on and ultimately created a film. I have to ask, the author of this book that gripped you, did you actually meet him, contact him?
Yeah, so George Sarantitus, he's a Greek researcher. He primarily lives in Athens, and George spent about 20 years working through Plato's philosophy and his use of mythology. He's published numerous papers in the 21st century. He's been at a lot of conferences. I found him to be incredibly gripping. And actually, we had our first conversation during the pandemic, 2020, and we talked for about 4 hours. He was just a gripping personality. He had so many ideas, and he'd done so much research, and he's a compelling speaker as well, right? Very, very well researched, very well grounded. And I think, Sean, one of the keys we have to remember as we approach this story, or we talk about it, is all great discoveries come right on the edge of the known and the unknown, right? So if you stick with what you know, you're never going to cover any new ground. And if you're just existing out in the idea of theories without getting some hold on proof, well, then it's always just speculation. So what I liked about Sarantitus was he had entered the Atlantis story without any preconceptions. He hadn't entered to prove anything, and he hadn't entered to disprove anything. He just wanted to get to the bottom of it.
Okay. So was he surprised when you contacted him?
I think he was used to a lot of nut jobs getting in touch with him on his website. He's got, I think it's platoproject.gr, so you can check out his work there. I encourage everybody who has an interest in the subject to do so. But I got a hold of George. We started talking. He sent me a copy of his book, which is unfortunately out of print. And, I spent the summer of 2020 holed up like many other people, reading George's book. And we, kept talking, became friendly. And at a certain point, I thought, boy, whenever I can get over to Europe again, I got to make a film about this guy. Somebody has to tell this guy's story, because it's so incredible. And like we were talking about a few moments ago, it takes Atlantis out of the realm of pure fantasy. It takes it out of the realm of pure philosophy, takes it out of the realm of pure history, and starts to look at it as this might be something that's an amalgam, a combination of different things. Like an onion, you got to keep peeling back these layers, and there's layer upon layer upon layer to the story. And to me, what motivated me to go make the film is it's like a detective story, right? You can look at different layers and you can examine them. They're all interesting. And then hopefully at some point you get to something reasonably approximating truth.
Absolutely. But tell me this, Jack, how does one commence this journey? You know, I mean, first of all, how did you convince your wife that the book she suggested suddenly has now become your life mission to create a film about it? You know, people can spend years on this type of thing. And we've had people on the show who've been giving us various theses around the idea of Atlantis and their own ideas upon it. And as you say, it's something which grips the imagination. But how do you actually start to go about turning that into what you've done, turning it into a film?
Right. So, I mean, luckily I had a film production company, so that's a help.
Yes, it is.
And a background in classics, also a help. So, you know, the first thing to do, Seán, and maybe it would be a little bit helpful to give people the context of what the original story was, just so they have a little bit of an idea. Well, the myth of Atlantis is presented in two books by Plato called Timaeus and Critias. He wrote those books probably around 360 BC, living in Athens, Greece. Plato, for those who aren't familiar, he was sort of the prime philosopher of the Western canon. His teacher was the famous Socrates, who was also a philosopher, never wrote anything. And the story takes place where Socrates and three other guys are hanging around in Athens one day, and they just start, you know, giving speeches, telling speeches to each other, you know, to pass the time on an afternoon. And one of the guys says, you know, Socrates, what you were talking about yesterday about the perfect society really reminded me of this story, almost word for word, that I heard from my grandfather when I was a kid. His name was also Critias. That's my name too. And he heard it from his father, who heard it from Solon, who was one of the 7 sages of ancient Greece. So this would have been around 600 BC. Solon allegedly had visited the Temple of Sais in Egypt, and there he had visited with the priests of the temple. Now that's a real place, and there was a real temple there, so that's all very legitimate. And he heard a story there about something that had happened in the distant past, so far back as to be almost unbelievable, right? 9,000 years before Solon's conversation. So that would have been around 9,600 BC. The story is there was this aggressive, hostile empire that swept across North Africa and most of the Mediterranean, conquering everyone in the path. And that only the sort of very early Greeks, led by the Athenians, were able to drive them back and eventually defeat this hostile foreign empire that was taking over the whole joint, taking over the whole Mediterranean world. And it's told in the context that Greeks, you people have lost your own history. You don't have a knowledge of your own history. It's like Graham Hancock likes to say, we're a species with amnesia. So the idea of the story is sort of, hey, Greeks, your history only goes back so far before it starts to turn into myth. But we Egyptians, we've got everything written down in our temples, and we know the full story. And that's why I'm telling you about Atlantis. You don't even know what your own ancestors were able to accomplish. So how do you go into a story like that? Well, the first thing that I tried to do when we were working on the film, and of course later I've published a book recently that I'd love people to check out if they want to go deeper into the story. But the first thing I did was I went back, and I'd read a lot of Plato in college studying philosophy, as I'm sure anyone who studied philosophy did. And I went back and I reread about 2/3 of Plato's books. That didn't happen overnight. So I went back and reread all these books because I wanted some context. You know, what was he writing before this? What had he written right after this? How does this story fit in with his other ideas or other things he may mention? He used myth in many of his works. What made this myth special? The second thing I did was I had to go in and fact check all of George Sarantitus's ideas. What were his translations accurate? What were his were his assertions about the geometry that was present and the geography of the original story, did they seem accurate? Did they seem reasonable? Well, that took a while. We filmed in the summer, I think it was, of 21. And it took a couple years of post-production to get the film out. So it came out in 2024. So if you'd like an overview of the Atlantis story, I really recommend people to check that out. But, the deeper you go into one of these things, Seán, as we mentioned, the more interesting kind of sidebars and facts and things you do. So the way I tried to approach the story was in three parts. One, what had Sarantitus figured out? What was his contribution to all this? Two, what was the reality of the world of 9600 BC? What do we know today from science, right? What do we know about the climate? What do we know about the geography? What do we know about, weather? What do we know about natural disasters? All this kind of factual information. Is there archaeological evidence for any of the kind of assertions in the story? And then once you get through that, you get to the third part, which is Platonic philosophy, other ancient sources, what was happening in the ancient world of Plato's era that might give us some context for some other layers of meaning in the story. So that's a long way of saying that we tried to cover it from different angles. And we also looked at, could this have been true, right? So I met with Oregon State University earthquake expert, Dr. Scott Ashford, and I said, Scott, George Sarantitus has a new theory here about how the destruction of an ancient civilization could have taken place. And one key from George is, hey, this has been mistranslated. This doesn't say there was a continent in the middle of the ocean, Atlantic Ocean, that sank. This says there was a city that got flooded on land that was probably in Northwest Africa. And could that have been real? Well, sure enough, Dr. Ashford and I talked through it. The location of the alleged capital city of Atlantis, that geography would lend itself very well to, a flooding event combined with an earthquake that could have destroyed whoever was living there at the moment in time. It doesn't have to be the city in the myth. Even if there was an ancient civilization, a collection of villages of hunter-gatherers or whatever, anybody there who got hit by a localized tsunami would have wiped out, whatever they'd built, right? Would have really wrecked the joint. So I think that's maybe a good start for how we tried to approach it and look at the true versus false. What do we know that could be true? What do we know that is true? What do we know that might be false? And what do we know that is definitely false?
So the popular misconception, Jack, is that, as you say, Atlantis was somewhere in the Atlantic and it sank for whatever reason we don't know. It could have been geological or from whatever. That is not your thesis. You're suggesting something different.
Yeah, and this is where the original Greek comes into play, Seán, because I speak a little ancient Greek. I studied Latin in college. I have a pretty good understanding of it. And when you go back and you look at some of these earlier translations, they do say, hey, this was a place that you had to cross the Atlantic Ocean to get to. But there's a number of really contradictory pieces of information that suggest that the Atlantic Ocean is not what was being talked about. And the first most important reason is that it's not the word okeanos, which is ancient Greek for ocean, does not occur in Timaeus or Critias. So if I said to you, hey, I'm going fishing at the Atlantic pond, and in 2,000 years, somebody thinks, oh, pond, he must have meant ocean. That's not right. So what the ancient Greek actually says is Atlantic pelagos. And a pelagos is a Greek word that means like a sea, like the Aegean Sea is called a pelagos by modern Greeks. That's different than like the Black Sea, which was called the Euxenos Pontos, which means the brackish sea, friendly to strangers. That's what the literal translation is. So, and then they called the Mediterranean a thalassa. So different words for different bodies of water. Now, that was the key problem. You say, well, then why did these intelligent scholars of classics at Oxford and places like that, no offense to my European fans, why did they mistranslate this? Well, the fact of the matter, Seán, is nobody had ever heard of an Atlantic Sea. Everybody knows what the Atlantic Ocean is. So at that era, right, most of these translations were kind of the mid to late 1800s that we use today. They didn't have a knowledge of climate change across deep time that we have today. So it never occurred to anybody, hey, there could have been some giant sea that connected to the Mediterranean that's today has dried up. So if they just sort of assumed, well, it says Atlantic Sea, the Atlantic Ocean's sort of a big sea. I never heard of anything else. Chauncey, have you? And then they sort of said, well, no, I haven't. He must have meant the Atlantic Ocean. That's the only body of water it could have been. But the facts are that people of that era, Seán, knew what the Atlantic Ocean was. The ancient Greeks knew what it was. There had been a tin trade going on with the British Isles since the Bronze Age. So this was not, people knew their geography. So it wasn't a mistake by Plato. That's, I think, a key point here is the assumptions that we modern people have made about the story was, well, either it was this or it was that, or the Greeks didn't really know what they were talking about. Plato made some mistakes. Really? Plato, one of the greatest geniuses of all time, made some mistakes, but Joe Smith, you're right. Okay. So I think we tried to approach it in the spirit of having a little bit of humbleness and really trying to look at what the original words said. And that opened up a totally different way of seeing this. And, I hope people will, watch the movie and read the book. But ultimately, Sarantitus realized that 9600 BC was, smack dab in a period of climate change called the Green Sahara. And, through a process of deduction, he figured out, well, to get to Atlantis, you had to cross this Atlantic Sea, which had to border on the Mediterranean. That's how you got there. Well, where might such a body of water have been? And if you go back to that time period, there was an enormous sea, which bordered on the Mediterranean, that you entered through the Gulf of Gabes, which is in modern-day Tunisia. And that has since dried up. Today, it's a series of really shallow salt lakes called shots after the French. And so today you can go there and there'll be these kind of broad expanses of playa, and they only kind of fill up during the rainy season. But if you went back 9, 10, 11,000 years, there was an enormous sea about the size of the Adriatic.
Right. Now, it's one thing to pinpoint a possible location for Atlantis, and you're doing a good job on that front. However, has your researchers given you any insights into what this civilization comprised of? I mean, was it a sort of a Greco civilization, or was it something totally unique?
That's a really good question. And unfortunately, the regions, a lot of regions of Western Africa have not been particularly well studied. And part of that is just resources, difficulty of accessing places, but there's also some safety concerns over there as well. So there are huge stretches of the Sahara where really fascinating discoveries of ancient cultures have been found from the time when it was green, right? And imagine this sort of Serengeti, and you have these watering holes and rivers and major lakes. Well, it would have been a different world. What we do know is that there were two major groups of hunter-gatherer people who existed in North Africa during this time period. We have archaeological evidence of these people. And one group spoke the language group Nilo-Saharan, and they came from kind of the Sudan, Ethiopia region. Mm-hmm. The other group were called the Land people, and they came from Mauritania, that area of Western Africa. Coincidentally, that's where the Eye of the Sahara is, the Rashad Structure, which people and Sarantitus have identified as being that is the locus or the geographic setting for the ancient capital of Atlantis, right? Well, so what do we see there? Do we see the society? Do we see any evidence of the society from the Platonic manuscripts? Well, those manuscripts describe a civilization that's a lot more like a Bronze Age or archaic or even classical Greek, right? There's huge temples with gold, and they have racetracks for horses, and they have trireme ships, huge navies, 1,200 ships, and they irrigate their fields, and they have, all this metal and this, that, and the other, and soldiers and chariots. There's no mention of spaceships, power crystals, nuclear weapons, transdimensional portals, or aliens. I'm sorry to say. So, what do we see? Was there some group that was just way ahead of its time, maybe a bit like ancient Egypt? Well, there's really very little evidence on the ground other than stone tools. So archaeologists have found huge amounts of stone tools around the Rashad. And so we know people were living there at this moment in time. So then this sort of begs the question, well, was Plato's story made up, or is it based on maybe a mythologized version of some ancient prehistoric events, right? And that's one of the things we go into in much greater depth in the new book, and we do touch upon in the film. There is some evidence, right? We talked about Atlantis as this power that swept from west to east, kind of wiping people out across North Africa. Well, there is evidence that the land people who originated in Mauritania and lived there during the last dry period spread out across the Green Sahara during that time period. So that sounds a heck of a lot like what we're talking about in the myth. The idea that they were fighting with chariots and had huge navies of triremes and stuff, that I like to think of that a little bit as maybe some layers that were added by Plato in his own era. So taking an ancient mythologized story, maybe of a great migration or a series of conquests or battles, and then sort of transforming that into something that his own audience of his own era would be able to relate to.
Now, am I wrong in thinking, because I'm sure you've heard of the sea people, they're called different things, but they appeared allegedly, we've had people on the show talking about them, they appeared out of nowhere. They were, colonizing bits and pieces of the Mediterranean. Is there a connection here between what was happening in your thesis in Atlantis and what was happening with these sea people, or is that something totally disconnected?
It's later. A lot of people have thought that maybe that sea people episode was an inspiration for the Atlantis story. That was, I think, around 1200, BC. Shortly after the time period we think of it as the Trojan War, there were all these battles and attacks. There's imagery carved in Egypt that shows sea people attacking and the Egyptians driving them back. But yeah, that was sort of 1100 BC ish time period. That has been said to be an inspiration. Of course, the destruction of Santorini has been said to be an inspiration. In Plato's own era, there was a city that was utterly destroyed by a tsunami and an earthquake called, I think it was Helike, which was on the Peloponnese. So there are other examples of great battles or attacks or natural disasters that could have contributed to the way the story is framed, the way Plato wrote it, for sure.
Now, we've mentioned Plato a lot as the genesis, I guess, for our modern understanding of Atlantis. In your researches, Jack, did you come across any other either ideas in literature or artifacts of one sort or another that led you to suggest that maybe there was more to this, that your thesis could be explained in other ways?
Yeah, and this is a real challenge, Seán, because earlier Greek travelers to North Africa and Egypt don't mention anything about Atlantis, right? Herodotus, Hecataeus. So a lot of people said, well, that means Plato made it up. Does that mean that he made it up, or does that mean that maybe he had access to sources that those guys just didn't happen to come across, right? There's no internet, there's no central library for every myth that's ever been told or every story. One thing that is interesting is you have to ask yourself, even if this was a myth that Plato heard and he wrote the story down, how on earth did he have the specific dimensions of the Rashad structure or any of this other geography if he himself had not been to Western Africa? And we have no evidence that he was. That means some piece of this has to be true, right? Somebody had to have at least been there, known about the dimensions of the Rashad structure, known that it was a series of concentric rings, right? And for those who want to check this out, just look up the Eye of Africa and you'll see incredible natural structure in modern Mauritania, which again corresponds to the geography that Sarantitus proposes. Well, again, here's a bit of a mystery within a mystery. How on earth did Plato know that this thing was about 40 kilometers across and that it had multiple rings? I mean, you couldn't know that unless either you'd been there yourself or you'd spoken to somebody who'd been there. That means the Mediterranean world had to have been in contact with the, Saharan African world. And we know that this was the case, right? The Carthaginians were a Phoenician people who took over, most of the Western African coast and parts of Spain. And we know about them primarily from their later battles with the Romans for dominance in the Mediterranean. But these people had huge inland trading empires, and they had been down to the Niger River. So my supposition is that if Plato didn't hear about this story in Egypt, he might have heard about it from the Carthaginians. Where's a good place for that to have occurred? Well, Plato lived in the city of Syracuse on Sicily for a number of years. And the western part of Sicily was controlled by the Carthaginians. And when they weren't fighting the Greeks, they were trading with them. So you can imagine some sort of discussion, Plato being a curious chap, he might have sort of said, hey, heard you've done some traveling. What can you tell me about inland Africa? And he may have heard the story, hey, there's this incredible place out there. Let me tell you about it. It's this big, and there's a story about an ancient empire there, and there's stone tools all over the place. It must have been a once mighty people. So so again, Seán, I think, one of the reasons I called the film and the book the Atlantis Puzzle and not the Atlantis Solution or Jack Kelley has the answer to everything is because I don't, right? It is a puzzle, and it's layer upon layer. And it sort of presents an opportunity to inquire into all this stuff and really open your horizons about the past, about mythology, about what we know about the ancient world, what we don't know, and to have a sense of openness for possibility, but also to approach it with a critical mindset.
Absolutely. Now, you've been on this quest for 5 years, Jack. Is it concluded now, or is this going to be a lifelong quest for Atlantis?
I think my Atlantis chapter has come to a close, Seán, with the publication of the new book, which you can find all over the world on Amazon.com or your country's version of that, also called The Atlantis Puzzle. And if you enjoyed the film or you like that story, I really go into a lot more depth, and every citation is footnoted. So if you want to go more into, hey, what do we know about the Green Sahara? You can dive in there. If you want to go more into Plato and the ancient world, you can dive in. But along the way, Seán, what I have to say is that this has transformed my view of the ancient world, because there were some things in this story that I entered believing would be false, and they've turned out to be quite the opposite. And a great example of that is prehistoric seafaring. I thought for sure there is no way in 9 or 10,000 BC anybody was sailing boats around and stuff like that. Like most people, I think we learn that it was the people in the Middle East or the Egyptians who invented boats maybe in 3 or 4,000 BC. Not true. There is incredible evidence, and we touch upon it in the book and the film, that people have been sailing the Mediterranean for not thousands, but tens and hundreds of thousands of years. And this was one of the most astonishing pieces of information that I discovered. Another piece was that there were transcontinental trading networks in the Stone Age. I never knew that. I mean, it seems baffling, but there is concrete physical proof, right? If there's a type of wheat that grows in Turkey and only there and has no relatives in Northern Europe, how did it get to the UK? I mean, somebody had to take it there, right?
Absolutely.
So I think, we have to, if anything, I've come away, Seán, with a deeper respect for how sophisticated the real people of the ancient world were.
Absolutely. Well, unfortunately, we've come to the end of our time together, Jack. Just remind people where they can find out more about you, where they can watch your film, and also pick up a copy of your book.
Check out atlantispuzzle.com. All the links are there, or just go to amazon.com and type in the Atlantis Puzzle. You'll be sure to find it. If you don't want to give Jeff Bezos all your money, go to Barnes & Nobles and you'll be able to find it there too.
Jack, for now, thank you so much for coming on Things Visible and Invisible.
Thanks so much, Seán. It was a pleasure being here.
Thank you for joining us on another episode of Things Visible and Invisible. We're dedicated to uncovering phenomena that challenge our understanding of reality, from ancient enigmas and paranormal encounters to scientific anomalies and forgotten histories. If you enjoyed this journey into the mysterious and unexplained, please consider subscribing to our channel and hitting the notification bell to stay updated on future explorations. Have a personal experience or story that aligns with our investigations? We'd love to hear from you. Visit our website at tvi.show and reach out through our contact form. While we can't feature every submission, we review them all, and your story might be featured in an upcoming episode. To support our continued investigations, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter or channel member. Your contributions make these explorations possible and give you access to exclusive content, early releases, and monthly behind-the-scenes discussions with our team. Don't forget to check out our merch store. We've got everything from TVI-branded t-shirts and hoodies to stickers and coffee mugs, perfect for showing your support while keeping the mysteries close. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time as we continue to explore the things visible and invisible.